Hello, welcome to another episode of the Practitioner-Scholar, a Penn Chief Learning Officer podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Marie Eard. To familiarize you, for those who don't know, PennCLO is an executive doctoral degree program through the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. The course of study focuses on organizational learning, leadership, and development within the public and private working sectors. It is also known as a Scholar Practitioner program, where there is an academic research component, meaning what is learned can be applied to the workplace through best practices. I'm a current student of this program, as well as our guest. In this edition, we will highlight Maria Luisa Garcia Underwood, a seasoned leader with over 30 years of experience in education and organizational development. She serves as the CEO of M Ideas Consulting Services, Incorporated, specializing in professional development. She is also an adjunct professor at Monroe College. Her previous roles include Director of Equity and Inclusion at Teaching Matters and Special Assistant at the New York City Department of Education. Maria holds 2 master's degrees from Teachers College of Columbia University. And as I mentioned earlier, Maria is a current CLO student, and I am more than excited to experience her knowledge and contributions to our community of learners in the CLO program. But you know what? I am even more excited to share that we hold a special bond through our sisterhood as women of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Today, Maria will share her passion and trailblazing initiatives in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the DEIB space. Let me get those acronyms right. The DEIB space, specifically on dissecting complexities of DEIB leadership and answering the question, how can leaders make DEIB initiatives transformative rather than transactional? All I have to say right now is welcome.
Hi, Lisa Marie. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am so excited that we're going to have this opportunity to have this conversation.
Awesome. You know what? To set the stage for our conversation today, we will dive into how you transformed your passion into your current study and work in the DEIB space, including the significance of DEIB practical approaches, wider consequences, and the effects of DEI washing. But let's start our chat about how your passion becomes your work. Maria, with over 30 years of experience in education and organizational development, what inspired you to delve into the field of DEIB?
I think it was just a natural falling into, if you will, in the field. I am a Afro-Cuban immigrant, so my first language is Spanish. So arriving in this country at a very young age and having really to navigate a new culture, a new language, I think it's been always part of who I am. It's ingrained in just my being. And when I was studying undergraduate studies in my focus really became the study and the research around teacher preparation for students in urban and inner city schools, in particular our public schools, because of the diversity, the cultural diversity, the linguistic diversity that exists in the student population in those schools. So before even entering as a professional into the field, my focus and interest was always that, I think, just because of who I am. And having taught in public schools, having led organizations in the public education spheres, it's always been a focus of mine in terms of my studies, whether in my master's degrees, really focusing on linguistics and language and programs for a bicultural, bilingual population, or even in my initial work within the New York City Department of Education and really looking at how to provide more culturally responsive education for students. So it was a natural, I think, just falling into the field just because of who I am. And my trajectory or my pivoting into the actual DEI work within organizations really came about as all of the years, more than 25 years of coaching and working with teachers. And it really started as the director of equity, diversity, and inclusion for Teaching Matters. So it was just, I think, a natural fit.
Wow, it sounds like it's homegrown, it's in your roots. Sounds wonderful. What does that look like within an organization? What is it and what is it not when you're talking about DEIB?
I love that question. And I think that it is really about organizational change and basing the foundation of DEIB work within the organizational spheres or spectrum, right? So it's about really creating transformational policies, transformational procedures within the organization that are really based on what the organizational and align to those goals, not separate, which is what I call DEI washing. When we think about these transactional aspects, when we create one professional learning session here, or we basically unpack microaggressions or biases, but really not undertaking the transformational work within the organization aligned to the organizational goals. So it really should be together and aligned and not something separate.
Nice. So currently you're a student at UPenn
Mhm.
in the CLO doctoral program. Can you share how your experiences in this program has deepened or even expanded your passion and your approach towards DEIB initiatives?
The beauty of the Chief Learning Officer program at the University of Pennsylvania is that it really truly does bring in practitioners in the development of their scholarly work and research. And so that intersection is really critical. And for me, it started with my interest and my research in how can I expand, how can I help other organizations to really undertake DEIB efforts in a way that really is truly transformational, that truly will have an impact and not just be these transactional moves. But it allowed me to also then really research organizational change and leadership. And what does that look like for leaders within a variety of organizations in multiple industries for them to really undertake DEIB work? So it's just been a perfect opportunity of a program to bring my practitioner, my 30 years of experience to the table, but really look at the scholarly, the academic, the research around organizational change and leadership capacities and skills that can foster DEIB. And so my research, ultimately my dissertation, will really be focusing on racial socialization around in organizations by leaders to make those kinds of changes.
Sounds like a perfect blend, a natural blend, a great fit. So I want to move on to talking about some work that you've done. So in 2003, you co-authored two articles on DEIB. One article was The Problem is Not Diversity. The problem is not diversity training. It's DEI washing. And
Mhm,
the other
mhm.
is A Leader's Playbook, The Power of Deploying and Operationalizing DEIB. So, with that, can you describe the significance of producing this work and how did these articles come about?
Oh, wow. Yeah, this is really exciting to talk about. So, this is again another example of the structure and organization of the CLO program at University of Pennsylvania and its ability to really not facilitate and foster this collaboration among your peers. So both of those articles are really co-authored by a number of other students who are now some who are still students in the program and working towards completion of their dissertation, and some who are alum. And really, it was an opportunity that was fostered by the program director and faculty for us to come together and really talk about all of our work, again, as practitioners, in the field, but what it really meant and represented. So the first one about DEI washing was really the impetus of it was really a response to an op-ed piece, if you will, that I believe was in the New York Times. That piece was ultimately published in the Chief Learning Officer magazine. And it really was us as a group really speaking out about why DEI efforts were indeed essential and what it was and what it wasn't. And that many of the actions, many of the moves that we see organizations undertaking, many of those leaders taking those moves are really DEI washing. They're transactional in nature. They're not transformational. And so we laid out in a very brief article what some of the research around what that really looked like, some of the moves that leaders should make. And so that was really just a great collaboration and opportunity. The second article, it really is laying out almost a playbook, 5 steps of playbook for leaders to understand where, if they're interested in really truly being transformational leaders and really transforming their organizations and genuinely believe in the DEIB work and can see the benefits for their organization and for their customer base as well, for the population that they serve, then these are the 5 basically playbook moves that leaders could take. And again, it was another opportunity for the same co-authors, the same contingent cohort of students to come together and bring to the table our expertise from a variety of different industries. But again, the practitioner experience coupled with that ability to do the research.
Thank you for that. So we've been hearing the word DEI washing.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain what DEI washing is and how does it differ from genuine DEIB efforts?
Right. So what we refer to in DEI washing in that article and then introduced in that 2023 article in the Chief Learning Officer magazine was the idea that in many organizations, folks are saying, well, we're doing DEIB work, right? And maybe it's not as impactful as we thought. Or in some cases are saying it's actually divisive in nature. And so we named what folks were really, or we called out what folks were really saying was DEIB work, and saying really it's DEI washing. And the reason that we called it that was because it was surface work. It was transactional and yet not transformational. So examples of that is when you bring in and do professional development about biases, right? Implicit bias, or you may do a session on microaggressions, or you do diversify your employee base and stop there, right? So you're bringing in more people of color, but there's no expansion or work on that. In other words, when you're not really digging in and aligning the DEIB work to your organizational goals, when it's not transformational. So an example of something that's transformational is, first of all, understanding where you are as an organization. And every organization is at a different place. Even organizations where their employees' self-perception reporting surveys might indicate that they feel they really work in a diverse, maybe even equitable environment, still may have room for growth in terms of inclusivity, in terms of really ensuring that their people feel like they belong within the organization, that they can be authentic. When organizational leaders take on and examine their policies and their procedures from recruitment to mentoring, and then make transformation changes based on that, that's transformational work. That's not DEI washing. So DEI washing is what we saw a lot of after the 2020 racial reconciliation, if I could say nationally, that many organizations were reacting and trying to be in support of, but basically landed and kept themselves at just a place where they were just addressing things like bias and microaggressions. It's the one-off, one-time kind of professional development that really doesn't afford the organization an opportunity to go deeper. Even when you're just basically hiring a person to be your DI director, and that person is brought in, but really not either at a C-suite level employee, or is not given the tools or the ability to really work with the C-suite leaders or managers below that to really make those transformations. So that's basically what we meant by DEI washing. Does that answer the question?
It really does, because what it sounds to me like, organizations might just be providing information and not including the education or application of the policies that they're enacting.
Right.
And given your experience,
Yep.
what are the most common misconceptions about implementing DEIB strategies in organizations? So we move away from providing information
Yep.
and we are educating and applying the work.
So definitely one misconception I think is that leaders can enter the space, or organizations attempt to do this very surface, as you said, informational kind of sharing, right? And that is what DEI work is. That I can provide a workshop on implicit bias or microaggressions, that I can recruit and diversify my organization so that now the faces on my website look diverse, right? And that is the DEIB work. I think the other major misconception is that it is only and solely about diversity of race. And while, yes, in terms of an area where clearly there's a lot of work to be done, and clearly folks present themselves based on who they are. And so race is something that's very apparent. DIB is really about diversity across the board. So it's race, it's socioeconomic status, it's ethnicity, it's language, it's gender, it's sexual orientation, it's diversity of thought. So an example for us in Teaching Matters was we were looking also at diversity in terms of our practitioner experience, right? And making sure that we were bringing in practitioners who we could send out to schools as instructional coaches that had a diverse number of years of experience in diverse content areas. So it's much more than just the surface, what I think most people think. So I think that is definitely a major misconception. And so if leaders are leading the work with that misconception, normally they're not even looking at their data in such an intersectional way to actually get and to determine to make some changes within recruitment, mentoring, etc.
One thing that just stood out, you really talked about the makeup of an organization.
Yep.
How does DEI washing affect both the internal culture of an organization and its external reputation? And if you can provide any examples with that, where DEI washing may have had a significant impact.
Typically, DEI washing has really had a negative impact on organizations because if that is all an organization is doing, and again, it's very surface, it's very transactional, not transformational, then it has the potential to be divisive. It has the potential to be internally. It also has the potential to traumatize those of color within the organization with no additional support. It has the ability also to misrepresent an organization's values to its external client, right? So if your products, if your services do not represent your customer base and you are addressing or speaking to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all that you've done are the surface informational workshop sessions, it can make your organization appear to those on the outside as not authentically, truly, genuinely interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think when you're really doing transformational work, again, it has to be aligned to your organizational goals. And it's not just internal. You also have to think externally about the product or services that you're producing and that customer base as well.
Interesting. So you spoke about organizational needs, structures, alignment, so forth. All that starts at the top, right?
Correct.
Let's talk about the critical role of leadership
Mm-hmm.
in DEIB initiatives. And coming from your view, what are the essential qualities of a leader who successfully fosters an inclusive environment?
So you're absolutely right, Lisa Marie. It starts with the leader. You are really communicating the need, the why, the purpose. You are presenting information, data usually about the why you're wish to proceed in a certain manner. So it really does start with the leader, and the leader being able to communicate to sell their perspective on why this is needed. And it has to be, I can't stress this enough, it has to be tied to the organizational's goals, right? So it's not something separate, and therefore it really should touch on every aspect of the organization. So leaders who are, it starts with self-awareness. It starts with their own development of their knowledge, right? It starts with being an empathetic leader that really understands and values why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for any organization, but certainly in any organization within our society, right? That we really need to promote that. So leader development, leader awareness, self-awareness is the beginning. A leader having been able to assess the playing field, if you will, to assess where is the organization, where are there gaps in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, in some organizations, diversity is not as much of an issue in that they can have been able to recruit and retain employees that are diverse, that represent that diversity that I spoke about before: race, gender, ethnicity, language, you name it, ability. So it's the whole gamut. And then they've also been able to think about appointing, whether it's an external consultant or someone permanently within, like a DEI director, a director of people, culture, separate from human resources, that is really able to help navigate and help support all of the C-suite level leaders within the organization, as well as the managers in that reporting line up to those leaders, to really unpack that, to really do that work. It starts with setting strategy and goals. So it's, again, like no different than if we were setting goals within our departments organization wide, that everything has to align. And then it really is about implementation and measurement and looking at the data again. There will be iterations based on that. And it's just continuous feedback, whether it's feedback, again, internally from your employees, whether it's through an employee self-perception survey or employee resource groups, if you set up affinity groups within the organization, and external feedback from your customer base, if especially if you're creating some products to be more inclusive and more equitable to your customer, and thinking about that if there's product revision or a new product in that way. So for example, in our case at Teaching Matters, one of the things that I did in the trajectory of being the DEI director there is that not only did we do a lot of internal work from looking at our recruitment of our coaches for the field, how, and the recruitment processes, from how are we actually recruiting, or how are we posting our positions, what are the prerequisites that we're putting in our postings, in our job postings, and are some of them already exclusive of a certain population? And is that a necessity? So we started from looking at our job postings to how we start to post our positions, to our interviewing process, to standardizing our interviewing questions so that we were asking every candidate the same questions and therefore had some metric. We created a rubric for measuring that. And we went all of those internal processes and procedures. We examined, we studied, we saw where there were gaps, where we were losing folks, or where we were bringing in folks that were being brought in, but really staying at the lower level. So you had a lot of people of color, but they were not progressing and moving upward, right? So there was no upward progression. How do we create mentoring opportunities for folks to move into more leadership positions and not just remain at our first tier in terms of coaches, all the way to creating an equity tool that we then presented to teachers in the field so that teachers could then also do their own equity work within their classrooms. But we created the tool for them. So those are all ways that a leader would basically move. And in our second article that our colleagues, our peers, right, produced last year or wrote last year, co-author, we named like those basic 5 moves within any organization. Yeah. So I'm
I
so
like
passionate
it.
about, and I'm talking so much that I want to make sure that Lisa Maria, that I've actually answered your question, because you're like asking me all these questions and we're on a topic that you can clearly see I love a lot. So I can just continue to talk and ramble. So please bring me back.
Not a problem. I think it's really interesting. And I really got caught up in the data mining, data gathering of information, and where you focused on recruitment and sticking on that part of it,
Yeah.
because I do want to go into the five ways that you just also mentioned,
Yeah.
but going backwards a little bit. So considering the Supreme Court stance on race-based affirmative action,
Hmm.
how do you recommend organizations adapt their DEIB strategies to continue when you're promoting diversity effectively? And how should organizational leaders begin that work?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because we did also have a lot of fear about, after the ruling, how organizations would interpret that and whether they would say, because it can't be race based, we're going to move away from diversity. And I think for me, one of the things that I do as a consultant working with organizations, bringing me in to do this DEI work, is really emphasize that there are many ways to really look at diversity, and that in some cases for that organization it may not even be specifically race. It may not be, that's not where the organization has a need to diversify. It may be in terms of ethnicity, it may be in terms of language. So it's really focusing on a more broader definition of diversity and what we really mean by that, rather than just having it be race based. Yeah.
I appreciate that because I think a lot of people get stuck on the word diversity. And you mentioned different aspects of diversity earlier, diversity of thought. You just said diversity of language.
Yeah.
And I think all of that is rolling into inclusivity.
Or,
But I want to also feed back to what you were talking about earlier. And I did let you ramble because rambling is great because you provide a great deal of information and knowledge coming from your standpoint. So, in your work, you mentioned a 5 step playbook
yeah.
for deploying and operationalizing DEIB.
Hmm.
Could you walk us through these steps and how they contribute to the overall success of DEIB initiatives?
So we named in that second article that we co-authored in 2023, we named 5 steps that leaders should take to operationalize DEIB in their organization, regardless of industry, regardless of organization, regardless of size of organization. And the first one we talked a little bit about before, which is leader awareness and leader commitment. And so it has to be clear from the top to everyone in the organization that leader has made a commitment to this work within the organization. And that starts with, again, the leader having self awareness of themselves, having some knowledge about what it is, and then having some informational data mining that you mentioned about their organization, like knowing exactly what is it that my organization needs, where are the gaps, and then having strategy and effective communication for communicating, for sharing that out across the board. And then also putting some money behind that, right? So any organization that makes a commitment and expresses a commitment in whatever area it might be, usually what follows with that is a commitment of some kind of funding source. And that can be represented in hiring internally a permanent DEI person. It can be in a commitment of bringing somebody externally to work with the organization as they roll out. It could even be a commitment to bringing in work and consultants or coaches to support within one area of the organization. So if recruitment and or retention on the other end is a gap, is a place where you're seeing a revolving door, or you're not able to have a mentoring process that really supports people to have an upward mobility within the organization, and so they're leaving you, that you can bring in a coach to really explore that and work on that area itself. So it's having awareness, having that knowledge, and then being able to really demonstrate that commitment. And again, it ties into communicating it tied to organizational goals. Then the second step was really having an assessment, having a baseline of where are we going, what's the need, and how do we move. So it could be that there is where the financial support is in hiring an expert to now actually bring about that work, right? And that's a lot of the consulting work that I've also been doing through my company, of like, how do I support entities to really carry on this work once they've made that commitment. And then step number 3 is having strategy and goal setting. Again, it's really important that this be part of an organization-wide goal. And just like we set goals in organizations on an annual basis and look at them periodically in our processes that we may have internally, this DEIB work would live within that as well. And then the fourth is really in implementation and integration. It's how do we implement this work, but integrate it into existing other venues. So I mentioned before that one of the aspects that I addressed while serving as a director of equity, diversity, and inclusion for Teaching Matters was the recruitment piece. And so that was aligned to other aspects, other efforts that were being undertaken under human resources, right? So at the time, we were also looking at our equity pay band. What are our pay scales equitable? Are there any things that are off? So the work of looking at the recruitment also fell in line with our goal of really looking at transparency in pay, but really making sure that it was apparently equitable and that we can communicate that with transparency across the organization. So it can be integrated with other existing work that's happening in the organization. And then the last step is measurement, iteration, and it's wash, rinse, repeat. You're measuring, you're looking to see where did we make progress, right? What iterations are needed, and then getting and doing that through feedback. So for us at Teaching Matters, one of the things that we did, and some of the work that I do through my own company at MIDS Consulting, is that we definitely take feedback from employees. In the case of Teaching Matters, we had both a perception if survey from employees on an annual basis that really led us to get information. But because we also set up affinity groups or employee resource groups based on ethnicity and race within the organization, we also took feedback from those groups as well. The affinity group feedback was really more aligned to like inclusivity and belonging. Did these groups allow folks to feel like there was a space and a place for them to actually bring forth not just their own personal day-to-day occurrence in terms of feeling, whether they felt they belonged within the organization or not, but also work-related opportunities that maybe on an organization on a higher level, the leadership may be missing out on, may not have, insight into. So feedback is definitely an important piece of that step number 5.
Great. So listening to everything that you've said, talking about implementing strategies and so forth and gathering information, what are some of the biggest challenges organizations face when trying to implement a robust strategy? And how do you think that they can overcome these hurdles?
Mm-hmm.
What pitfalls do you think can be avoided?
So I think the biggest challenge, and one that I've seen frequently, is pushback, and pushback from many different levels of the employees within an organization, not feeling that this is really a necessary focus, feeling like it could be divisive, feeling like, why are we talking about any of this? Why is this important? Why is it necessary? And I think that where I've seen organizations avoid that challenge is where leaders have gone in prepared with a really good amount of data of gaps. So if you go in prepared to say, the reason we're taking on this work and the reason that we're looking at our recruitment, as an example, or retention, or a new product that we want to develop is XYZ, right? So we want to put forth this product because we know that we serve a customer base that we're not necessarily attending to their needs in the best way. And so I'll give you an example of organizations of like dollar stores, if you will, like bargain stores in communities. You may have not provided sufficient training of the employees on the ground in the field, where you are not really meeting the needs of the customers that go into there, or are not as receptive, right? Not feeling like you have not created a welcoming environment for those customers, because there are some preconceived notions or biases that may be held because of where those stores are located in certain communities. So it's really digging in and knowing your data so that you can avoid some of these challenges, because usually the biggest challenge is going to come from your employees. And it comes at a variety of different levels from different folks, different people. So I think that's the biggest one. Tell me again, Lisa Marie, there was a second part of your question.
You actually covered it because it was, what pitfalls should they avoid?
Yeah. I think that's the biggest one, is an understanding, and the research has shown this as well, that understanding the biggest challenge is going to come from your people. And the pitfall that you want to avoid is not being prepared with real solid baseline data as the leader, and then having an effective mode of communication. How do you communicate this in a way that really gets that folks can hear the why, understand, and can feel that purpose? So I think that's really the biggest challenge, and the pitfall to avoid is miscommunication of something. This is not something you put out in a newsletter and send it out. And it really has to be communicated in a way. And again, no different than organizational leadership. And the research also shows this: organizational leaders that are really impactful and effective are those that really have different modes of communicating with their people. And so it's the same thing. It's really laying out data, setting up goals, and then communicating effectively.
So it sounds like these are the ingredients for success,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And when thinking about success, you also have to look into the evaluation portion of it. So, how can organizations measure the impact of their DEIB initiatives, and what metrics should they focus on to ensure they are moving beyond just mere awareness, just that information,
Yeah.
to actually creating that systemic change?
Yeah. So definitely feedback from your employees. And I've mentioned that a couple of times. One of the things that I do when I'm in the field in organizations serving as a consultant, as a DEI consultant, is that we're going to set up surveys to get information. We're going to set up interviews. We're going to do our research about the impact of the work that's happened. And that can happen in an annual survey, again, like a self perception employee survey. It should happen at different levels. And that's where maybe interviews can really foster and provide that kind of information. If there are employee resources groups that are set up, those affinity groups, that's a perfect place to also get some additional data. Then there's also the quantitative data, which is, if there was a hiring issue, let's look at the hiring data pre and post, right? If there were, let's look at our interviewing data. We had X number of folks interview. What were the demographics of those folks that interview? What was the percentage of those folks that moved from interview 1 to interview 2 to actually onboarding? What was the impact of onboarding? Again, even onboarding folks, there should be some feedback, whether it's in the form of a formal survey or other practical feedback, one-on-one, maybe with HR, that you're getting from folks after the onboarding process. So if we were revamping that's what we want. If it's obviously a product, we want to get feedback from our customers in terms of how did that product, was it helpful? I used the example a few minutes ago of like training people in stores, in communities, like in the dollar stores, so that you have folks on the ground that are really receptive to the customers that are coming into that store, and not approaching or building policies or procedures in those stores that are biased in nature.
Maria, you are in the role of a consultant.
Yeah.
So let's change the roles a little bit.
Sure.
If you were to hire a DEI or equity consultant for your organization,
Yes.
what would the consultant do?
Okay. Great question again. So, what I would want the consultant to do, and where I think they should start their work, is assessment. They need to be able to help me as the leader of the organization identify those gaps that I talked about earlier. What is it that we as an organization need to do to move in DEIB work, right? Because again, DEIB is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? And so diversity obviously is about the numbers, is about representation. Equity is about once you have that representation, what are the opportunities for my employees to really grow within my organization, within that entity? Inclusivity is about do they really have an opportunity for me to have all the voices at various tables represented? And then how do they feel about being in the organization? Am I really creating an organization where folks feel like they belong, like they want to be there, like they are committed, that we have the same mission and that we have the same values? And so I think the consultant would need to really assess and look at those different levels, different areas within that DEIB work. And then once that assessment is completed, my expectation would be that the consultant is now going to be setting up my L&D, right? My learning and development plan for that coach for the support within the implementation. So what will that learning plan look like? It can be informational sessions. Certainly it shouldn't stop there, right? Because then again, we're going back to just that's DEI washing. It goes much broader, much further than that. But what does my professional learning plan look like and look like for in different areas, right? So it might be that there's a L&D plan for my leaders on the C-suite, my managers, and that maybe folks in other areas are looking at other aspects. It could be departmentalized, but the coach or the consultant should really be identifying and creating that plan with me and for me. And then it's helping me to create strategy, to really think about even when the organization is really leading in DEIB work, that they've done a lot of work in terms of diversifying the organization. They really have been attentive to like equity issues and really maybe are living in inclusivity and belonging and creating those spaces, which makes them an organization that's further along in the journey and the trajectory of DEIB work. Even those organizations, there still needs to be strategy, right? There still needs to be figuring out how are we going to do this. And if the organization is not that far along and there's a lot of work to be done, then it's really strategy and goal planning, right? Because everything can't happen immediately or happen today. So creating those kinds of timelines. The consultant also should help me to set up stakeholder engagement. Again, it is critical that I, as a leader in an organization, really communicate this. But how do I make sure that all of my stakeholders, both internally and externally, are engaged around this work? That's part of what a DEIB consultant also does. Policy review and development, looking at our policies, looking at what are our processes within that, making sure that there are not points where we are again identifying some biases or places where we are unintentionally, but nonetheless excluding folks from either moving upward or even coming into the organization. Some data analysis with that. Hopefully the consultant is able to make recommendations for implementation and assist with ongoing monitoring and monitoring implementation and then consistent feedback. And sometimes I know that I'm brought in because of a specialized experience or area. And so sometimes DIB consultants are also hired based on an area that they really have a specialty in. So it could be an issue of really diversifying around ableism or disabilities. It could be in terms of diversifying and really bringing in a veteran population, meaning like in the military kind of service. It could be linguistic, right? So consultants are equity consultants or DEIB consultants can be very instrumental and leaders in this work for organizations, but sometimes are really tapped into or hired based on a real specific specialty if a leader has already identified some serious gap within their organization.
Sounds like big shoes to fill. Definitely lots of good work.
Yeah.
So, looking ahead,
Yeah.
let's take a futuristic look into the world of DEIB. How do you see the field evolving, especially in the light of current social trends, current economic trends?
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the future of DEIB?
So there has been some pushback. We're all aware of recent pushback against any DEIB efforts, even a call out that DEIB actually has been harmful or wanting to bring death to DEIB. I think that for organizations that really understand the mission and the importance of it, especially in a society that is only continues to be more global and more diversified. By 2040, 2050, it is predicted that in the US, in the context of US, and this doesn't include other data points for abroad, but in the context of the US, that we will be a majority minority population across the board, not in as a whole society, not necessarily like within any industry. So when you think about an organization and its customer base being what I just mentioned is projected for 15, 17 years from now, it behooves every organization to really take a look at this work because, again, it's about organizational growth and organizational strength, putting yourself in a position of strength and potential growth because you're thinking about your customer base, whether it's from a product or a service perspective. So I don't see it necessarily going away because I think organizations understand the value, see the future, can see the numbers in terms of what's projected population. But I do recognize that there's been some pushback, and a lot of the pushback has been anchored on the DEI washing that has occurred for so long, as opposed to really looking at impact work. And I also think that as consultants, as experts in this realm of, in this world of DEI work, that I think we have to continue, and all of my colleagues, our colleagues within this program who are in the DEI space, my co-authors on these articles, they all are in the same position. And really, you said before that a DEIB coach, from what I described, sounds like a big shoes to fill. There are many in this program that could really fill those shoes and are doing that work today. And I think all of them and those who I can speak for that I may not know who are doing this work continue to really push organizations to really go deeper in their DEIB work so that they can see the impact that we all know can happen. And I think will provide other data, other research for us to counter those voices, those opponents out there who say DEI should go by the wayside. So I hope that answered your question, Lisa Marie.
Thank you for that. Yes, you answered the question perfectly. As we start considering our leaders,
Yes.
we have some leaders who are coming up in this space,
Yeah.
in this time. What advice would you give to emerging leaders who aspire to make DEIB a transformative force in their organizations?
I would definitely say that I want them to really think about those 5 steps that I recommended earlier that leaders should take to do this work. But I also would recommend that for those who are actually going to be doing this work, either as a consultant or as DEI directors, or bringing forth information to leaders to support them in this work, I think that they should anchor their work around the research. And there's so much research out there about organizational change, impactful, effective organizational change, and leadership skills and competencies that one should have in order to have the greatest impact on an organization. Because again, this DEIB work should not be seen in isolation, in a silo from other organizational change aspects in the world, which is a point, and I think a wonderful attribute of our CLO program at the University of Pennsylvania, that it actually fosters for us the opportunity to bring this experience from the field as a practitioner and marry it with all of this research around leadership, around organizational change, around learning and development, and then using that research as a scholar to now build your work skill set, your practitioner experience. Yeah.
That is a perfect segue to my next question, because I'm sure it was heard throughout the context of this interview. You transformed your passion into your study and into your work. For any prospects who are considering a doctoral program and contemplating their area of research, what advice would you give?
I would say go definitely with your passion. Research and dissertation work, doctoral work of any kind is difficult and sometimes can be lonely, especially when you get to the dissertation stage and it's just you and you're writing. And so if it is something that you're passionate about, and again, in the case of us having the fortune of being part of this program that marries both the practitioner and the scholar work, it's really what we do on an everyday basis, right? And so definitely thinking about your passion, what you want to do with that you're passionate about, where can you have the greatest impact? For me, we started this conversation, Lisa Marie, talking about what brought me into the DEIB work. And I started by saying, it's just who I am, right? It's ingrained in who I am because of my lived experiences. And so I think for me, it was a passion in terms of the work, what I'm currently doing, what I'd like to study, but it's also because of where I want to make the greatest impact. Because of who I am and because of my lived experiences and because of what I do every day, where can I have the greatest impact for a better society, a better future? And in my case, with my industry in education, for the children of tomorrow. So for me, I think my recommendation would be is think about researching and writing your dissertation or joining a doctoral program, and hopefully it's ours because it is a phenomenal program, the CLO program at University of Pennsylvania. But think about how you can marry your passion with where you want to see your impact. Where is your legacy?
I love that. And I am looking forward to experiencing that in our program. How has the Penn Chief Learning Officer program shaped and influenced your identity?
It has just permitted me to authentically be who I am and foster just a greater passion and love. So throughout all of the blocks of learning, I have been afforded the opportunity, given the structure of the coursework, afforded the opportunity to really dive in deeply and think about DEIB, which is what I love, what I do every day, but think about it from maybe a more narrow lens, the focus of that learning of that block, right? Of that block of courses, of classes. So whether it was leadership, organization, whether technology, it really has afforded me and given me the opportunity to really go deeper. And I think in that sense, it just allowed me to flourish in terms of my own identity. Yeah.
Love it. So we're going to move away from the tough questions and the probing questions. And I'm going to try to circle around to a fun question.
Okay.
And that is, if you could have one superpower, what
Mm.
would that be and why?
I think, wow, that's a good one. A superpower. All right. So I think being able to lead with your heart. I think if I could, in everything, lead from the perspective of love and empathy, I think that would be an incredible superpower
Why?
because I think it allows me to then see, to go in and see people from an asset perspective, a positive perspective rather than a deficit perspective. So if I am approaching or meeting you, Lisa Marie, and I'm already coming from a purpose of love and empathy, then I'm really trying to see Lisa Marie and recognize and see the assets and the benefits rather than deficit. So I think leading from that would really be a cool superpower, to always be in that position of really seeing and appreciating. And I think it's part of what I think is missing, especially in this current environment of people being so polarized that we're not really seeing or hearing each other. We're not really appreciating the other person's perspective, which again, diversity of perspectives is as important as diversity of anything else that we've talked about today. But yeah, I think that could be a really cool superpower.
I think it would be a cool superpower too. So we're down to our final question.
Yes.
I'm going to be creative here. Imagine that you've been given the opportunity, the chance to create a new holiday dedicated to celebrating diversity and inclusion. What would you name this holiday, and how would you envision people celebrating it?
Oh, wow. So immediately my reaction is, I don't know that I want just one holiday for this. And part of it is I'm going to come to it from the perspective of, I think DEIB work is about celebrating humanity. And I think that should happen every single day. And I know you wanted me to be creative. I don't have a name for it, but I do think that it's something that could be and should be about what each of us does every single day. Does that answer your question?
I love it. I'm going to help you out a little bit because you said it.
Oh,
Humanity Day.
there you go. All right. Just we're going to repeat it 365.
There you go. Oh, this has been amazing. It has been wonderful connecting with you on this level.
Same here.
So, Maria, thank you again for your time. This has truly been a great informational session. So I want to say this for anyone who would like to follow you and your DEIB work, what's the best way for them to contact you?
The best way would be through, I'll give my website, and then also I think an email is perfectly fine at MIDS Consulting Services. So it is midsconsulting.com. And again, it's M and then ideasconsulting.com. And then Maria at midsconsulting.com as well.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you to all those who are listening. This has been a wonderful episode of the Practitioner-Scholar. Until next time.
Thank you, Lisa Marie. This was really so much fun.